Okay, I would like to welcome you to Module 6. You've been working on it for some time now, and so you're aware that we are taking a look at the Jacob cycle. Before we jump in, let's start with prayer. Dear God, as this summer moves by ever more quickly, we ask your guidance and presence with us. Move in our hearts and our minds as we study your word. Help us to see all the ways in which your providence remains with us, just as it was over all of these biblical ancestors so long ago. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, first of all, I apologize for not getting this lecture posted at the same time as the rest of the module. With 27 students, I had a lot of grading to do last week, and I wanted to get your papers on the Genesis 22 passage back in time for you to have some time to incorporate my comments into your new papers that will be due this coming Friday night at midnight. For this third paper, you're going to be doing parts 3 and 4 of the exegetical process. Part 3, you'll remember, is context, and that's where you will talk about what might have been going on historically at the time when the passage was written. And how might that have influenced what the authors wrote. Of course, with Genesis, that can be particularly complex because the book was probably composed over a long period of time. But your commentaries will be the source of information primarily pertaining to historical context. Probably even more important, especially with Genesis, is going to be your literary context. That is, how does the passage that you're looking at and interpreting fit into its location within the book? How does the material that has come before it in the book, perhaps quite a ways before it or just before it, how does that affect our understanding of it? And then how does the material that comes after it affect our understanding of it as well? Again, this has probably been the most helpful part of the exegetical process for me over the years. As some of my professors told me in graduate school, the 3 most important rules of exegesis are context, context, and context. So I hope that you will find it helpful to get some practice with this part of the exegetical methodology. So having said that, let's go on and talk here a little bit today about the Jacob cycle, which begins in Genesis 25 and goes through the end of chapter 36. As we get into this, we're going to discover that there are some similarities as well as some differences between the Jacob cycle and the Abraham cycle. Like the Abraham cycle, the Jacob cycle is going to be concerned with the promise that God has made to the ancestors, that promise of land, descendants, and blessing. Jacob is, in this cycle, going to become the heir to that promise, but we're going to see that some of the same issues that arose in the Abraham cycle are going to arise here as well. Namely, there are going to be a lot of threats that are going to seem to endanger the promise, and so part of the story is going to be focused around how God is going to overcome those threats and keep the promise alive. Walter Brueggemann has pointed out that in the Abraham cycle, the primary issue is how that promise is going to be passed from one generation to the next, namely from Abraham to his son Isaac. And so that's why we spent so much time talking about that, and of course that was all given rise to by that concern over the fact that Sarah was barren. If the issue of the promise passing from one generation to a next was the primary concern of the Abraham cycle, in the Jacob cycle we're going to focus more on relationships within the same generation, particularly the relationship between Jacob and Esau and how that all plays out. And so keep that in mind as we go along. Brueggemann also says, secondly, that the Abraham cycle is concerned primarily with promise, and the Jacob story is concerned primarily with blessing. So we kind of have these twin themes that work together in Genesis, promise being especially emphasized in the Abraham cycle, and then blessing being emphasized in the Jacob cycle. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of the Jacob cycle, and so I'd like to go through that with you now. Here's our outline of the Jacob cycle. It's going to begin in chapter 25, beginning with verse 12, with the genealogy, kind of the genealogy of Ishmael in this case and how that all plays out. And then after we get done with the genealogy, we're going to have a story about Isaac and a foreigner. This is some of Isaac's interactions with Abimelech, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. Following that, we're going to get especially into the best known part of the story perhaps, which is a conflict between Jacob and Esau. We've already got one brief example of conflict here in chapter 25, which is actually before this story about Isaac and Abimelech, but then primarily the conflict between Esau and Jacob is going to be in chapters 27 and on into part of chapter 28. That, as we will see, is going to lead to Jacob running away from the promised land to try to save his own life, and as he is on his way out, he's going to have an encounter with God in that fantastic dream that he's going to see. And then finally, Jacob is going to get to Haran, back up in Syria, where he is going to encounter his father-in-law Jacob, or his father-in-law Laban, excuse me, and that's where he's going to marry Laban's 2 daughters and also have a couple of concubines, and at that point he's going to be giving birth to his 12 sons. Eventually, the relationship between Laban and Jacob is going to fray, as you will remember, and so he is going to come back home, come back towards the promised land. That's going to create a certain amount of suspense in the story because, of course, Esau was very angry with Jacob when he left, and so as Jacob is now coming back, the question is whether Esau has forgiven him or whether Esau is still going to be attempting to kill him. That conflict with Esau that we had in the first part of the story is going to now give way to reconciliation with Esau, and they're going to have this beautiful scene in chapter 33 where Jacob and Esau are going to come back together and be reconciled. Then we're going to have Jacob's sons are going to have kind of some issues with a foreigner, and we're not going to talk about that passage a whole lot, but the whole story is very interesting, as it is in chapter 34. And then finally we're going to finish with the genealogy of Esau in chapter 36. So what we have here is something that is kind of known as a chiastic structure or a concentric structure to the story. Sometimes when authors want to emphasize one point in particular, they will do this kind of structure, and of course the middle part is going to be what they are emphasizing most, which in this case is the things that happen when Jacob is with Laban. Right before Jacob is with Laban and right after, we're going to have an encounter with God in both places. The relationship with Esau in the levels beyond that, and so forth. So that's kind of an outline of the passage. Let's take a look at some of what's in this passage now. So then the first thing we talked about is going to be the genealogy in chapter 25. Once again, we're going to have another one of those Toledot formulae. These are the generations of, is going to begin this section, and it's going to tell here the genealogy of Esau. So not the one who is the heir to the covenant, but the one who is the spare. And then from there, we're going to go on in verses 19 to 34 to tell about the beginnings of the story between Esau and Jacob. And at this point, the conflict between Jacob and Esau is going to begin, but it's going to begin already before their birth. Even while these two twin brothers are in the womb, they're going to struggle together within her, and their mother, Rebekah, is going to go talk to the Lord, and the Lord is going to tell her that 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. So, of course, as we'll find out, back in those days, typically the oldest child would have inherited twice the inheritance of any other children, or the oldest son would get twice as much as the other sons. And so Jacob, as the younger child, would have typically gotten only half as much as Esau would get of their father's estate. But as they are born, in verse 26, we're going to see that Jacob's hand is gripping Esau's heel, and that is explained as the derivation of the name Jacob. He takes by the heel, or he supplants. In chapter 25, beginning with verse 29, we're going to have the first instance of conflict between these two brothers. Esau is going to come back from the field where he has been hunting, and he is going to be famished, and he is going to tell his brother Jacob, I would like some of this red stuff, this soup that you are fixing. And Jacob says, first sell me your birthright. In other words, Jacob is basically saying, you have to give me all the rights and privileges of the oldest child. If you will allow me to inherit 2/3 of Dad's estate, and you're willing to go with just one, then I will be happy to give you some of the soup I have been preparing. And so it's kind of interesting. We begin to see the character of both of these people developing at this point. As we go along, we will see that Jacob is going to be conniving and tricking, and some of you have mentioned that in the discussion questions for this module. But Esau, on the other hand, doesn't come across in a too positive a light either, does he? Esau is going to come across as being perhaps stupid and being ruled by his own hunger, being ruled by his own fleshly desires, and not being able to control those desires enough to hang on to his position as the oldest son. And so we're already starting to see some of the characteristics of the two of them develop. Notice that in this part of the story, Jacob is not yet necessarily shown as being dishonest or deceiving. The deal he offered Esau is very straightforward, and we might say that Esau was the one that was dumb enough to take it. Historically, Sarna is going to say that ancient legal documents do contain descriptions of birthrights being transferred and sold and so forth, and so what they did was part of what was possible under the customs of the time. Following this end of chapter 25, let's go on and take a brief look at the story about Isaac and Abimelech in chapter 26. In the story, Isaac is going to go to Gerar and to King Abimelech, and he's going to settle there on the command of God. And at this point, Isaac is going to pull that same wife-sister trick that his father had done 2 times, and so Isaac is going to try to pass Rebekah off as his sister so that his life is not threatened if the king wants her for his own harem. Dr. Arnold, on page 236 of his commentary, lists a number of important similarities between Isaac and Abraham, and so I'd like you to take a look at that page briefly if you get a chance. And I think the reason that we have this story here is to demonstrate that Isaac is now a patriarch in his own right, and Isaac is the heir to the promise. And so these similarities between Isaac in this story and Abraham in some earlier stories serves to show that Isaac is now the patriarch and the heir of the promise. Walter Brueggemann suggests that blessing is the main theme of this story in chapter 26, and interestingly enough, blessing is going to come through material prosperity. For instance, in chapter 26, beginning with verse 12, it's going to tell us that Isaac sowed seed and reaped 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich. He prospered more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envy him. So blessing is continuing here. We saw that God had promised Abraham a blessing back in chapter 12, and at this point we're emphasizing that blessing is now being visited upon Isaac, so God is continuing to keep this promise of blessing into the next generation. But again, interestingly here, that blessing comes through material prosperity. One more thing I think that is important about this chapter is that the promise that God had given to Abraham is also going to be repeated now to Isaac. In verses 3 and 4, God says, I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall gain blessing for themselves through you and your offspring, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge. In other words, the same promise that God had given to Abraham is now being given to Isaac, emphasizing once more that God has kept his promise and that Isaac is now the heir, the legitimate heir to this covenant. Beginning in verse, later on in verse 13, in verse 23 and 24, we're going to have that blessing repeated one more time. So Isaac is now taking over from his father the role of the patriarch. One more comment that Dr. Arnold mentions pertains to verse 3, where God tells Isaac, "Reside in this land as an alien, and I will be with you. I will be with you." In other words, even though Isaac has gone to a foreign country, God is still going to be with him, which is significant because the assumption back in those days is that the deities, the gods, were connected with a specific geographic location. So each god is worshipped separately at a different spot, and if you go to a different location, you would worship a different god. But we're starting to see here now that God has attached himself to a person wherever that person might go, and not just limit himself to a particular location. Okay, let's go on and talk a little bit about the next section of our outline, which is going to be this conflict between Jacob and Esau. And this is going to, again, revolve around the theme of blessing. In this case, however, Jacob is going to come by the blessing dishonestly. You'll remember that in chapter 27, Esau is sent out to the field by their father Isaac to do some hunting. Esau was the hunter and the outdoorsman of the family. Jacob was kind of the mama's boy who liked to stay at home and cook and do all of those things on the home front. And so Isaac sends Esau out. He wants Esau to get some game so they can bring it back and eat it and kind of have a celebratory meal. And then Isaac promises, "I will give you the blessing that is going to belong to you as the oldest son." And so, of course, you know what happens next. Esau goes out into the field to do his hunting. Rebekah has heard what Isaac has said to Esau. And so Rebekah says to Jacob, "Come on, we're going to make you seem like your brother Esau. You are going to go stand in front of your blind father, Isaac. You are going to pretend that you are Esau, and Dad is going to give you the blessing instead of giving it to Esau." One of the things that Jacob does to give their father the impression that he is Esau is that Jacob covers his arms with animal skins. And I always like to ask my undergraduates, you know, how hairy must Esau's arms have been so that they could cover Jacob's arms with animal fur to make them feel just like Esau's arms? Of course, Jacob is going to get the blessing deceptively, and Isaac is going to give him the blessing. And of course, what's going to happen next? But Esau is going to come back home with his game ready to claim his blessing, and Jacob will then come to a realization of what has happened, and he will tell Esau essentially, "I'm sorry, I have already given the blessing to your brother." When Esau realizes what has happened in chapter 27, verse 34, he said to his father, "Bless me also, my father." But he said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." He asks, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" And Isaac says to Esau, "I have already made him your lord. I have given him all his brothers as servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?" Part of what's going on here is that the blessing, once it was pronounced, was seen to have an effect that could not be reversed, and so even Isaac himself could not take it back, because in the pronouncing of the blessing is also the giving of the blessing, and that blessing could not be reversed, and so poor Esau is left without the blessing. Now you can tell or guess what is going to happen next. Esau, of course, is going to want to kill his brother Esau. Esau, rather, is going to want to kill his brother Jacob. Their mother, Rebekah, is going to be perfectly aware of this. She is going to convince Jacob to flee back to Haran, where she was originally from and where her family was from. And she does so by telling Isaac that I think Jacob should go back to my home country and marry somebody within our family rather than marrying one of these Canaanite women. And so Isaac agrees with that, sends Jacob on his way with a blessing one more time as he is getting ready to go. Esau here tries to please his parents in the meantime by marrying a non-Canaanite woman, but as Dr. Arnold explains, he marries Ishmael's daughters, and that only solidifies his position as the son who has squandered his birthright, the one who is outside of the covenant promises. Okay, and so now the covenant is being carried down through the family of Jacob, even though he is the younger son. And it is being given through the family of Jacob because of Jacob's own trickery, because he drove a hard bargain and got Esau to sell him the birthright for some food, and now because he has tricked their father into giving him the blessing that would have been reserved for the older son. Of course, as Jacob is heading out again, Esau wants to kill him, and so Jacob is going largely to save his own life. And we can imagine what kind of thoughts are going through Jacob's mind, but we can imagine even more than that, the kind of suspense that this raises for us. It's just at that point that Jacob lies down at Bethel and has his dream in chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. It's a very important story and a great story, but I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because I'm going to wait and see what you have to tell me about it. I'm sure your insights will be more profound than anything that I could say. But the paper then will be on chapter 28, verses 10 to 17, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you are going to say. So let's go on now and talk a little bit about the story about Jacob and Laban. You'll remember when we had that first sort of chiastic outline, we said that this was kind of the central part of the story in chapter 29, verse 1 to chapter 32, verse 21. So what happens? Well, first of all, Jacob is going to arrive back in his mother's homeland in Paddan Aram in chapter 29, verses 1 through 14. And of course, once again, we're going to have a story about an ancestor's wife being met at a well. And so he is going to go and he is going to meet Rachel there at a well. And of course, he's going to think Rachel is very beautiful. He's going to be invited home by Rachel's family, only to discover, of course, that Rachel is a relative of his, that Rachel is one of his cousins. I really enjoyed reading some of Dr. Arnold's comments on chapter 29. First of all, Dr. Arnold refers to verse 7, where Jacob tells the men sitting around the well, "Look, it is broad daylight. It is not time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them." Pertaining to that verse, Dr. Arnold says that Jacob seems to be accusing these men of being lazy and telling them, "Get back out in the field with the sheep," which is kind of interesting that the stranger would come passing by and tell these men that they are being lazy. Another verse that Dr. Arnold comments on here is verse 10, where it reads, "Now when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban." Dr. Arnold makes the comment that these stones were very heavy, and normally it would have taken at least two people to roll one off the mouth of the well, but yet Jacob does it himself, and so perhaps he's trying to impress the people by performing this kind of a feat of strength. At any rate, of course, he goes home and is going to become so enthralled with Rachel that he is going to ask for her hand in marriage. He does not have any kind of a dowry to offer, and so Laban and Jacob work out this deal where Jacob will work for Laban for 7 years, after which he will be given Rachel's hand in marriage. And so that's exactly what they do. And after those 7 years, Jacob is excited to marry his new wife, and so they get together, they have the wedding, they make a feast, and then it tells us in chapter 29, verse 23, "But in the evening Laban took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, 'What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you? Did I not serve with you for Rachel?'" Again, I always like to point this out to some of my undergraduates in a fairly secularized college, that this must have been quite a wedding reception, because you'll notice that it was not until the next morning after the wedding night that Jacob finally realized he'd been given the wrong person. So I think this is an example of the biblical authors injecting a little bit of humor into the narrative by giving us some hints about what Jacob's condition must have been. Of course, Jacob is none too happy about this situation. Laban tells him, according to custom, the older daughter is supposed to be married first, but if you will agree to work with me for another 7 years, you can also get married to Rachel. And so that's what they do. What's interesting here, at any rate, then, is that Jacob, as a trickster, as a deceiver, has finally met his match. He's been used to getting what he wants by being manipulative and deceitful, and now somebody has done exactly that to him. In any case, of course, after the wedding, Jacob and his wives are going to begin having children. And I've always thought it's interesting that Leah is the first one to have children, and God gives Leah the first child sort of as a consolation prize almost, because she is loved less than the other wife is. And so we're going to see that from these 4 wives are going to be, or from these 2 wives and their 2 concubines, are going to be born the sons who are going to be the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in your reading from the Sarna commentary, you might remember that Sarna says there are probably some historical memories here behind these stories of the births to the different wives. Probably the sons would have been chieftains of the various tribes that eventually existed in Israel, as he calls them, and perhaps these 6 Leah tribes, in other words, the 6 sons born to Leah, would have originally been a unit. And Sarna suggests that there is some memory of those tribes kind of existing as a more cohesive unit, and that is probably what gave rise to the story about them all being full brothers. You'll notice that also 4 of the tribes are born to some of the maidservants, and Sarna suggests that this might preserve kind of a historical memory of 4 of these tribes having a subservient status when compared to the rest. And so when the story is told, they are made the children of the maidservants instead of the actual wives. Sarna also points out that the 2 oldest sons, Reuben and Simeon, must have originally had some kind of supremacy among the other tribes that they later lost. Typically, stories like this would have the ancestors of the superior tribes named first as the oldest children, and that's why Reuben and Simeon were oldest. But obviously, as we know, they turn out to be more minor characters in the history of Israel, or more minor tribes in the history of Israel. So Sarna is speculating that somehow they lost their status somewhere along the line. Walter Brueggemann spends quite a bit of time in his commentary pointing out that this is really the central part of the story, the birth of children. It's the central part of the entire Jacob narrative. This is what really, in a way, the whole book of Genesis has been leading towards. Because up until now in Genesis, barrenness has been the norm. And now finally we have fertility. 12 sons being born to the patriarch who is the heir to the promise. Moreover, Brueggemann points to Jacob's remark in chapter 30, verse 2, when Rachel is angry that Jacob has given him no children, that Leah is having all the children. And Jacob says, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" It may seem like sort of an argument of a married couple blaming each other for something, but yet Jacob in a way speaks the truth here that the narrator wants us to understand. God is the one who gives fertility, and God is the one who is finally giving children to this Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob family line after so many years of barrenness. The story about the mandrakes, Brueggemann says, prove for us that any human attempts to bring fertility are not valid, are not going to work, but that only God brings fertility. Finally, Brueggemann suggests that verses 22 through 24 of chapter 30 are really the climax of the entire Jacob story. Then God remembered Rachel, it begins. You might remember when the Bible talks about God remembering somebody, it is usually referring to God turning toward someone with God's providence and graciousness and improving their situation. The one example that comes to my mind is chapter 8, verse 1 of Genesis, where it tells us that God remembered Noah, and that's the point at which God causes the flood waters to subside, eventually leading to this new covenant with Noah. That's kind of what's going on here as well. God remembered Rachel, and God blessed her and heeded her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach," and she named him Joseph, saying, "May the Lord so add to me other sons." And so Brueggemann says the movement of this entire central part of the Jacob story is from barrenness to conception and birth, and comes not through any action of human beings, but purely through the act of Yahweh. However, in spite of the fact that Jacob here has provided his father-in-law Laban with 12 strapping young boys, his grandsons, things do not go smoothly between them. In fact, some conflict develops, particularly between Jacob and some of his cousins, some of Laban's sons and his brothers-in-law. And part of that conflict has to do with the way that Jacob gets very wealthy as he is working for Laban. In chapter 30, verses 25 through 43, we're going to see that Jacob and Laban are always negotiating about what Jacob's wages should be. Jacob says, "I will take all of the speckled animals that are born as my wages, and you can have all of the spotted colored ones." Laban then tries to pull a fast one on Jacob by pulling out all of the speckled and spotted ones so that those would not reproduce, and so that any animals born would be born only to solid colored parents. And then you'll notice that Jacob does a little bit of magic here. He sets up those sticks or those poles, those pieces of bark, and strips them off as the animals come and eat. And when they mate in front of those pieces of wood, they reproduce speckled and spotted offspring. So essentially, the whole point of this is that Jacob is getting very wealthy, and Laban sees that as being at his expense, and his brothers especially see that being at their expense. And so eventually Jacob comes to the conclusion that he's no longer welcome there, and that he's going to have to go someplace else. And so given all of these problems that are going on, God enters the story in chapter 31 and tells Jacob that you are going to have to leave, and you are going to have to get out of here, and you are going to have to go back. And so Jacob tells his wives, God has told us we are supposed to leave. And so in chapter 31, especially beginning with verse 3, And really all the way on through verse 16, Jacob is going to be telling his wives about these ways in which God has told him he needs to leave. Now this, in my understanding, this is kind of a unique part of the Jacob cycle. We saw that in the Abraham story, it is very typical for God to talk to Abraham, just say, go do something, and he goes. Or to have a debate with Abraham about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, or to continue to appear to Abraham and promise him the coming of more children. We have not seen that kind of direct intervention of God appealing directly to a character in the Jacob story in the same way until now. And so for the first time, it seems that we're seeing the narrator give a more direct description of God's involvement in Jacob's life and of God giving particular instructions to Jacob about what he is supposed to do next. Jacob is still not perfect. We still see that deceptive side of Jacob coming about. In verse 20 of chapter 31, it tells us that Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. But nevertheless, Jacob and his whole family get up and they begin to head back towards his home country. Jacob then is on his way home. But of course, this again is going to continue to raise suspense for us as readers, because of course, what happens? What's waiting for him back at home? Of course, his brother Esau. The last time they saw each other, Egypt wanted to kill him. And so in a lot of ways, Jacob here is a man who is not safe anywhere. He's a man without a country. He has felt that he's unsafe with Laban's family because they are jealous of him and kind of resent the wealth that he is building up around them. And so God tells him to leave from here. But yet if he's going to go back home, we know that he has not been welcome there as well. And so you can see that as Jacob is getting up and going back towards home and getting ready to go back to his family, the violins are starting to play louder, the orchestra is playing louder as we build up the suspense on the movie screen in front of us, wondering what is going to happen. Is Jacob going to be able to survive, which is what is necessary for the covenant to survive, right? So is Jacob going to survive, or is the promise of God once again in jeopardy? And so that's kind of a brief outline of that central portion of the Jacob story where Jacob is at Laban. And the central part of that then is going to be chapter 29, 31 to chapter 30, verse 34, where it's going to talk about the birth of Jacob's children. So once again, fertility following on barrenness is what is going to be driving essentially this whole story. So before we go on, let me give you the chance to think about two questions. First of all, in 29 to 31, how is God portrayed? And secondly, how is Jacob portrayed, and does he change? First of all, how is God portrayed in this section? And then secondly, how is Jacob portrayed, and does he change? I'm going to give you a few minutes to pause the recording, write down your responses, and then you can turn it back on and we'll talk together about some of the things that I've seen. Okay. It seems to me here that commentators, for the most part, seem to suggest that the main point of all of this is that God is the one who is directing all of these events. God's providence is working itself out, and God is thus working to make sure that this promise of land, descendants, and blessing for all of his family is fulfilled. First of all, we see that God overcomes barrenness and grants fertility. Isaac says a simple prayer for Rebekah, and that's all it takes for her to get over her fertility, so to speak, and immediately Jacob and Esau are born. So we don't have chapter after chapter after chapter of stretching this out to see when we're going to have children. Rather, Rebekah is able to get pregnant after one prayer by Isaac, so to speak. And then when it comes to Rachel, God is both going to remember and hear her, as we pointed out. And overall, there is going to be this quick succession of children with all 4 of these women. So Jacob is going to have 12 sons in fairly short order, which again is a great contrast to the Abraham cycle, where it seems that Abraham was not even able to have one. So the sudden birth of 12 children emphasizes again the theme of fertility and blessing, which kind of go together. And you might remember that that takes us all the way back to Genesis 1:28, right? Where it tells us that God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." So just as blessing and fertility were the blessing that God gave to all of creation, that twin theme of blessing and fertility continues to be with us, with God in the patriarchal family. Another thing to think about in terms of God's action in this story is the reversal of primogeniture. Okay. As we said, typically anyone would suspect that it's going to be the older child, the older son, who is going to be the heir, but instead, who is given that role? That role is passed on to Jacob the younger. But in spite of that, God still brings his promise to fruition. It seems to me that it's almost a way of saying that God does not have to work according to human requirements if that's not the way God wants to do things. Brueggemann, in referring to chapter 25, where we begin to see that primogeniture reversing because of Jacob's trickery, Brueggemann says that Jacob is a scandal and God is a scandal. Jacob is a scandal and God is a scandal. And so God here is portrayed as one who can act in spite of Jacob's character. God acts in spite of Jacob's character. Jacob is a trickster, he's a conniver, he's deceitful. He finally meets his match in Laban. But yet, in spite of all that, it is through Jacob that the promise is being fulfilled. Not through someone who is perfect, sinful, holy, and righteous, but somebody who is rather a trickster like Jacob. And so we see that divine intervention, especially in chapters 30 and 31, as Jacob is getting ready to leave. We are also going to have in this section the continual repetitions of the promise. The promise is going to be repeated to Isaac a couple of times in chapter 26, as we saw. It's going to be repeated to Jacob in chapter 28. Jacob will repeat the promise then back to God in chapter 32, verse 12. So that promise still continues to drive the action. Okay, so there is always this divine intervention. God, in this part of the story especially, becomes suddenly more active than God had earlier on in the story. And then finally we have the question about how is Jacob portrayed in this story, and does Jacob change? And part of that story about Jacob's character and whether he has changed and what his character is like compared to the first part of the story is in chapter 32. And part of this story, part of this is what you are going to be writing your final paper on for the class. And so I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about that. Certainly throughout much of his story, Jacob is deceitful, and he may be that way at the end, but I'd like you to really think about how his relationship with God is and his trust in God is as he begins to prepare for that final fateful encounter with his brother Esau. So finally, moving on, we're going to have this final encounter with God that Jacob is going to have in chapter 32, verses 22 to 32, and that is going to be that famous wrestling scene. Dr. Arnold has a good explanation in his book about the geography of all that, so I would encourage you to open a map and take a look at how all that takes place. They seem to be crossing over the Jabbok River, and a lot of people, going back to the Old Testament scholar Gunkel at the beginning of the 20th century, traces this story back to perhaps ancient stories that existed about river demons trying to keep a person from crossing river and end up giving that person a gift. And so perhaps that tradition of storytelling has found its way here into the Jacob story. Dr. Arnold points out it's ironic that Jacob in this story asks for a blessing from the man who is wrestling with him, because already earlier on Jacob had stolen a blessing, okay? And now here he is asking for one. We also have in this story, its pivotal nature is shown by the fact that this story includes a name change for Jacob. So the one who was the heel grabber or the supplanter now becomes the one who has striven with God. A major change in a person was often marked by a change of names, and this gives us, of course, the etiology of Israel, and would have been used as a story by the Israelites to tell where their name came from. It's interesting here as well that the opponent refuses to give his own name. There was a tradition in the ancient world that the name of somebody contained somebody's essence, and so that the stranger does not want Jacob to know what that name is. Some people have compared this to the occasion God finally does reveal his name in Exodus 3 to Moses at the burning bush, but we see that even there God doesn't completely reveal who he is as he explains the name Yahweh. In any case, Brueggemann says that there is kind of an ambivalent ending to this episode. Jacob has both a new name but also a new crippling with his thigh, which has been injured. Okay, and so finally we come to the final part of the Esau-Jacob story, or the Jacob cycle that we're going to talk about, and that is going to be the meeting between the two brothers. And of course this is where the suspense really begins to arise as we get into chapter 33. He's going to divide the wives and the children up into different groups so that if one of them is attacked, perhaps others of them will be able to escape. But we'll see instead in verse 4 that Esau is going to run to meet him, embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And they had this great time of reunion. The word face here is very interested in this story. We see that in verse 10, Jacob says, "Truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God." That is intending to draw a connection with that story of Jacob wrestling. And in chapter 32, verse 30, it tells us that he called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." And so the point perhaps seems to be that Jacob has survived seeing both God's face and Esau's face. Dr. Arnold suggests that seeing one's face has to do with access to someone of higher status. So perhaps here Jacob is admitting to Esau that Esau has higher status, so he's really bowing before him and humbling himself before his brother in this way. The continued Lord-servant terminology is going to continue through the rest of chapter 33. It may suggest that Jacob wants to maintain some distance from Esau, according to Arnold. Finally, one more thing that Arnold points out is that in this story, Jacob is bowing to Esau, which is just the opposite of the blessing Isaac had pronounced. When Isaac said to Jacob, "May your brothers bow before you," now Jacob is the one bowing before Esau. Later on, in verses 15 through 17 of chapter 33, Esau is going to want Jacob to go and continue on and journey with him, but Jacob does not do that. And it says, so instead he's going to go to Sukkoth and build himself a house and make booths for his cattle, and that's the name of the place, called Sukkoth. So that may suggest as well that there still wasn't complete trust between Jacob and Esau, and they almost wanted to maintain some difference between themselves. Finally, the Jacob story, the Jacob cycle is going to conclude with the long story about the rape of Dinah in chapter 34. As you'll notice if you've read Arnold's commentary. There's some debate about whether that was actually a rape or whether it was more of a consensual encounter, so to speak. If you're more interested in that debate, I would invite you to go there and take a look at it. A lot of scholars suggest this part of the story was probably added later on by an editor who wanted to be critical of intermarriage between Israelites and non-Israelites, or between Jews and non-Jews, if this was a later story. And then finally, we're going to have Jacob go back to Bethel in chapter 35. We're going to once again see an appearance of God to Jacob. And then finally, Benjamin will be born once they get back to Rachel, who is going to die in childbirth. The final part then of the Jacob cycle is going to be the listing of Esau's descendants in chapter 36, where once again we're going to have the descendants of the brother who is not the heir. I hope you have enjoyed this very fast journey through the Jacob cycle, and that you have also enjoyed the more close reading you have done about it from both commentaries, and from the biblical text. I know that you're in the midst of a paper on this, and I look forward to reading that. As always, I'm more than willing to answer any questions you might have, so get a hold of me by email or talk to me on the phone. But until then, I look forward to receiving your paper. Thanks for joining me today.